I'd like to welcome everybody here on behalf of the Learning Analytics SIG. My name's Hazel Jones. I'm one of the facilitators of the SIG. I'm currently based at Griffith University on the Gold Coast. Also with us is Linda Corrin, who's one of the other facilitators. And our presenter this morning is Cass Colvin, currently at Charles Sturt University, who's going to do the presenting today. Cass would be well known to a lot of people, a very avid writer and researcher and proponent of learning analytics around Australia and globally. And I'm sure we're all going to get a lot out of today's session. So I'm going to hand straight over to you, Cass.
Well, thank you. Right, so here's our topic, which we threw together hoping that it might actually provoke some sort of reaction and get people here. But it's actually for me quite an important question, and I think that learning analytics now sits at a very interesting juncture. And what I'm finding is that, you know, I sort of bridge the practitioner world and the academic world, and the academic world, of course, is slightly ahead from the practitioner, but in the practitioner world, I'm still in a world where I'm being asked about impact, and there are concerns that there isn't impact, and even in some of the research, there's still a critical focus on lack of impact through learning analytics. The topic also came from a blog that's now on your screen that we wrote, the Escalite SIG exec, after the conferences at the end of last year. So Escalite and also ALASI. For people new to learning analytics, ALASI is a wonderful forum. And we just are starting to note, I'm feeling that through the research that I'm seeing and through the conversations that I'm having with people, I think that we're on the cusp of a very positive change in how we're framing learning analytics that I think will be really powerful in how we perform it. Having said that, and in spite of Hazel's beautiful words, I'm no expert at all. If people can tell me how to do my job, I would love that. I have one of those unfortunate roles of manager learning analytics. Also through the talk, I don't think we have answers. I instead am hoping that after this presentation that we might start having a broader conversation as a community around some of these issues to see if they are themes that resonate with you in the audience, and if there's some possibility of us perhaps community working together to, I guess, in some cases problematize what this is, unpack it, and then think what can we do about it, which would be really nice, rather than all individually grappling with some common issues. So as I said, I'm a learning analytics manager. That's fantastic, given that really, you know, you can write learning analytics to be whatever you want. It's so multi-ontological that that's part of the problem. But I do have a pretty bog standard role there. I'm meant to get people around the community interested in learning analytics, which I like to think more of as data to inform learning and teaching practice. And it's, I guess, I privilege more of an evaluative sort of framing of learning analytics. But there's always that, I guess, more performativity, sort of, we need to report what's actually happening back to management as well. A lot of what we do, of course, is working with academics to get them to share in conversations about data, what it means to them and how they can use it in their practice. To get us thinking about learning analytics, I thought this would just get us a little bit more into the zone. About a year ago, I was in Sydney, and there's a beautiful exhibition centre there, you know, on Darling Harbour. I don't know quite what it's called. It's just a gorgeous spot. And to the side of the building was this installation art. It was actually this very one, even though this is when it was on a different building. I don't think this is taken from when it was installed in Sydney. And this art, I just really resonated because I was in Sydney to give a talk on learning analytics, and it was a talk where I was proposing a move away from learner-centred analytics to learning-centred analytics and what that meant to me. And I saw this because this is actually public art that is informed by big data. So, you know, it's streaming big data. In actual fact, it was astronomy big data. And that was changing what was seen on the screen that was, you know, forever being updated. And the data was also generating a soundscape that accompanied this. So it sort of, I just thought, isn't this really powerful? Here is something here that is, I guess, a representation or a reformation of something that has existed for a long time. Public art has been around for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. and what this artist, this Japanese artist, did is challenge what it was and use new technological affordances to take it in a slightly different direction. And I think that that's what learning analytics is. And if we look at the Siemens definition here that we have all seen, I'm sure many times, it just reminds us that it's really about trying to understand learners, their contexts, and how that all works together to shape learning. So I guess it's just a redressing of something. Now, accompanying this, of course, is a bit of hype. You know, it's going to lead to a world of better learning and teaching. It's going to be, because everything's going to be evidence-based. And here are some of the tools that we're going to use to achieve that. Yeah, who knows? And I think this is at the point, I think that there's actually emerging in, there's certainly been in the academic space, a level of criticality around these points for some time, but even now in practical performances of learning analytics across the universities, I think these are the conversations that we're now having, and I think that they're really helpful. So if you think back to when learning analytics first came out, a lot of these articles sort of capture that. Some, you know, Siemens 2011 there, Oblinger 2012, you know, there was quite a bit of hype. There's still a little bit of hype even now in 2017 and 2018 in some of these articles, but it does promise, and I think it's not necessarily just the analytics, however we want to construct it. I think evidence-based practice and really trying to understand learning and teaching more holistically will lead to better outcomes. But I do like very much this slide that Paul Prinsloo presented last year in one of our webinars, where he observed that there had been this ongoing hype around the revolution that learning analytics was going to generate. And with this slide, he sort of had the comment, "I'm still waiting for this revolution," which is, of course, a reference to the fact that it might not be transforming our learning and teaching as obviously or as radically as we might have thought. Anyway, as a sector, we're moving on. We're doing nice little dashboards and visualizations. We're all very busy. And then, hypothetically, this might have happened to somebody like me last year. I was literally called up, and my DVC did ask, "Look, we're spending all this money. Where is the impact?" And, you know, she's not alone either. Where is the impact? Which is why we're talking about this now. And it's something that the sector is looking at too. So this was done some years ago in 2014, and work by Ferguson as well. She's done some good work looking and critiquing what's happening, that there's a gap in the field. And even more recently, Dirk Iffenthaler, this was a book that has only just been released, 2019, and again looking very systematically. It was a literature review looking at empirical findings, and again thinking, well, are we really having the impact? Before going on to the impact, I thought I'd just start to talk about, well, here are some of the common narratives that we hear, and this is the first one. Well, it's hard to have impact because it's been slow to uptake because it's complicated. It's complicated. Doing learning analytics is complicated. So the sector has worked very hard on giving us lots of helpful guides on how to do learning analytics. And the vendors are really, really helpful too, because of course one challenge is setting up all of the capabilities to produce visualizations to analyse. So the vendors provide different tools for us. And the algorithm, we've got algorithm work, we've got predictive modelers and things that are now coming with all of our tools, with our LMSs, with our VLEs. So that should help us too and make it easier and more efficient. We've got the affordances of AI, and we've even got the government giving us different frameworks, standards and things to do. Yet still we've got this kind of lag going on. And this is where I'm just going to ask you to bear with me, because this to me is the CAS perspective. This is not empirically informed. This is just my take. I believe part of what the problem has been is that when we're designing our learning analytics, it's about thinking about what do we understand by learning analytics and what do we understand by learning. So I always come back to what I call the ontological framing of what we do, which is what it is to be. So a lot of learning analytics work is we're reporting on things, we're designing things, but the actual construct or the purpose for it, I think is where we might need to be focusing a little bit more. So if we translate that, let's think about learning. So we do learning analytics to tell stories about learning. I've got two pictures here, and you'll see that in here we're reminded of a number of the complexities that are involved with telling stories about learning. So in one picture we've got paper-based, which is very inconvenient for learning analytics because that's activity that we can't capture through trace data. We've got people working together, perhaps co-constructing knowledge. Perhaps they're gaining a sense of connection with each other, and that's enhancing their connection to their learning because they're feeling part of a learning community, social connection, belongingness, things like that. Construction of knowledge. We've got, on the other side, we've got an individual learner who's learning through a mobile app in their own time, I guess, in some ways, you know, this is kind of challenging notions that we have that people will sit in lectures or read our lectures or do things in regular ways. The new learner, they can learn through multiple medium, multiple modes and at different times. The other thing too is that where is the learning actually happening here? So are these all processes or steps or antecedents that are going to lead to a learning outcome, or is learning the process that we're actually seeing here? Do we have to wait for a certain knowledge transfer or knowledge evidence base, so they actually have to do an assessment for us to demonstrate that learning has in fact occurred? So learning, the temporality of learning is an acute challenge, I believe. So I think that this is something that for me is really important. So when thinking about learning analytics, what are the stories I'm trying to tell about learning? But more behind that, what are my assumptions? What's my premise? What am I framing learning to be? And I think if we don't do this, then our findings and insights will be compromised. And I'll just show a little bit of this now. We need to, I don't think we'll ever come up with the perfect tool, the perfect way of telling stories. I think the way to go forward is to tell multiple stories, and they'll all have a different lens. I think what we need to be mindful of is that every story perhaps that we're telling might in some way have some limitation. So here we go. Let's have a look. We've had all these, this is how you do it, and yet institutions are still finding it difficult to do this learning analytics because it's not stepwise, it's not logical, it's not chronological. So now in the literature, we're seeing the emergence of a new way of thinking about implementation of learning analytics, to something that's more distributed, to something that's more disruptive to existing structures. In this paper, we found some really, really interesting patterns with regard to even the role of policy. Formal structures, formal policy was in fact seem to be working against a more innovative take-up of learning analytics, curiously. Look at the vendors, very, very helpful. But unfortunately, they privilege the easy data. And as you would all be aware, behaviour and demographic markers alone do not equal learning or engagement. Engagement is a multidimensional construct. I'm going to talk to that later on. Yet we invest so much time making attributions based on what students are doing, whereas in actual fact, what they're doing is often a lag of many, many antecedents, such as what they're thinking, feeling, and our learning designs. The other thing about the vendor products and the visualizations, and that's the space that we do work in, the visual is really, really powerful for reducing complex stories so that people can digest them. But we need to be mindful that the visualization is open to interpretation and is, I guess, contested as even the objectivity of statistical methods. I think I can see an increased focus on bringing more data science. I think there are now 10 or 11 universities in Australia that have data scientists sitting in their learning and teaching units now, so that we can start to supplement the visualizations with some more rigorous statistical sort of analysis. And the other thing too is that with vendor products, I think what they do is, because you know, they're privileging really, I believe, you know, the tools that will be helpful for an academic at the level of the subject, what they're doing is they're sending messaging to the university community that that is learning analytics. That's certainly what I find talking to different people. Whereas in actual fact, I think the meso and macro level analytics is where universities will get real benefit. So where you start to do your analysis of flows across complete programs through faculties, or even looking at institutional level performance. So let's have a look at the algorithm. Oh my goodness me. Yeah, it's not neutral. It starts with the data that we put into it and the methods that we use. And this was actually brought out just recently in this year's LAC. Chris Brooks, who, if he's not known to you, he's just a little piece of gold in the learning analytics community. He works at Michigan, and he had a best paper there that also showed, and you know, at the top level, you know, the need to caution against the fact that many of the methods that underpin our algorithms will favour sort of what I call, because I'm the layman statistician, I'm the nightmare, I don't come from Chris's background, but they actually will favour the majority story. They'll actually end up coming up with an algorithm that models the outcomes for your majority, rather than, if you're not careful with your controls, telling you the story that sits in the minority. And just as an example, some early work's being done in my own university. It was actually issues around different citizenships, different backgrounds of students was silent, and yet within those different elements, and even external students at another university that I was at, did not come out as a risk factor, because at that particular university we had a very small number of external students, yet within that external students we knew that they were an incredibly vulnerable cohort, and that 50% were likely to attrit in their first year. But that didn't come through in the modelling until the controls were put in place by our data scientists. And here we go. You know, we do have a thing that with all this modelling, ultimately we're going to get to this personalisation. Students are going to be agentic, they're going to control their learning, and it's going to be fantastic. But at the same time, we're also thinking about how we can nudge students, how we can sell them messages, how we can transform their learning so that it's giving back to them what they prefer. A bit like Facebook and things like that, where we're getting messages that they know we would like. And so we've actually got a nice little tension there about the agentic learner, how agentic are they? And I think that's really important. And here we go. This QA policy and compliance framework, I find this a little bit, this is my world, it's all about KPIs and blah, blah, blah. It kind of reduces what learning analytics is to almost just business intelligence. But more than that, I think that when you start to look at the summative, which is really, you know, it is needed, what tends to happen is that becomes the stopping point, rather than thinking, well, formatively, what could we do? How can we explain? So we do a lot of data capture, but we don't do a lot of presentation of data that can explain. The other thing too is that I think when we're thinking about summative reporting, the need to be cognizant of the metrics that we're reporting against, and are they conceptually, empirically or theoretically grounded? Like, do they make sense? You wouldn't want a metric that's students must wear orange shoelaces, but sometimes you feel that some of the metrics you report to are as helpful as that. I'm sorry, that's a bit cynical, but that's how it can be. Now, so let's go. So how is this ontology? Let's just go a little bit more. So I'm going to acknowledge Hazel, because Hazel last year did a presentation where she sort of compared learning analytics to a tree, which is kind of cool. And I'm now not telling a story like the story she told. She had a beautiful metaphor that she extended in a gorgeous poster, and we might send that out with these slides to people who are interested. But what I'm thinking of, and this is how I explain talking about to people, if we are trying to make insights into learning, but we're only focusing on one part of learning, then we might give an incomplete picture. So it would be like with a tree, suggesting to people, this is a tuat tree actually from a very small region in southwest of WA. I'm from Perth, and so the Tuat Forest is an area just sort of south of Bunbury. It's quite gorgeous, beautiful, beautiful trees, but you can see it's very sparse. But the trees, they're very large. Anyway, it would be like me saying, yep, Tuat trees need this climate only, and just measuring everything about climate. So everything to do with temperature, in fact, temperature, let's just have it at temperature, maybe sunlight hours, but forgetting about soil quality, nutrients in the soil, and also forgetting about rainfall. So you can see that if then decisions were made to plant tuat trees based on only elements to do with the climate, they actually might not do so well if the other things are there. And funnily enough, that's actually what happens. That's why they're a very endangered tree. So with learning, I think that we have that problem, and I think the thing is that we might not ever come up with a way of telling the whole story about learning, but I think it's important in our messaging that we actually state, then here is learning, we actually state what it is. To put it crudely, I often say when people are looking at dashboards that are about hits of students on particular content items, people will say, what is that? I'll say, well, it's actually a dashboard showing you hits of students on particular content items. And then we talk about what that could possibly be sharing to them in the context of what they're trying to achieve as a learning, you know, as a teacher. The other thing too is I think that if we go and make these claims about this is the answer and here we are, we've got the 42, I actually think we're militating against a meaningful value proposition for our academics, and that's something that I've come up against too, and perhaps some of you have as well. There are some academics that are not comfortable with learning analytics, have made judgments about learning analytics, and one of the things I hear is that it is reductionist, and in actual fact early attempts of learning analytics and many of our dashboarding does reduce learning analytics. I think if we acknowledge that, that's fine. That's fine. And then we can say, how can we have more sort of comprehensive pictures for you, I guess. So let's look a little bit more at this learning. I love this. I mean, this says something about the sector, that we had to actually have our top two sort of leaders, professors, write a paper called Let's Not Forget Learning Analytics Are About the Learning. So here's the first problem, learning. What is it? How does it look? We've already looked at that picture before. but also there are so many ways that people want to explain. If you're going to find, you think, oh yeah, I'll find a theory. You hear people say theory-based, but here are all the different theories. It's very complex. There are different affordances. Those theories represent different shapers of learning. They represent behaviourist opinions. They represent behaviourist theorems. They represent the fact that how students think and feel shapes their learning. They also show us that learning can also be shaped by structural elements. So you've got sociological and anthropological things going on there too. John Lodge, a couple of years ago, in fact, he's done some more recent work too, where he's thinking about these issues. This is a really nice paper, which just spoke to me too about looking back at all of those different theories. In actual fact, maybe we also need to start thinking about a transdisciplinary and almost a multidimensional approach. Bear with me because I'll show you how this can look at a simple form. We've got other people that are starting to remind us that affect, behaviour and cognition does affect learning. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but we need to think a little bit more than just the behaviour. So with the behaviour, can we also get a sense of why the behaviour, what did the behaviour mean, what's shaping the behaviour? And I think if we get into the affective and cognitive elements, I think we could be on to a really, really nice way of understanding our learners. So these are just some of the new ways. So you can see that a lot of the emerging literature is really starting to look at, so this was looking at understanding of learning environments, but looking at students' engagement as both cognitive and emotional with quite rigorous modelling as well. And this is a lovely paper. Sho and Vita are now at UniSA, and Sasha Alexandra has left UniSA, but UniSA is doing some really nice work in this too, where in here they propose a model of learning that is very similar to Yekaterina's that I showed before, involving affect, behaviour and cognition. So if we're thinking about that, what is it? Student emotion, negative or positive, student anxiety, motivation, even student satisfaction. So Bart Rientis did a landmark study where he actually used student experience, you know, the subject experience surveys where they talk about their perceptions of their experience with their learning and teaching as a proxy for student satisfaction. Then cognition, we know that these things affect, and many other cognitive processes, but simply how students regulate themselves, how they manage themselves, how they manage their time, how confident they feel, their belief in their self-efficacy, their goal setting, their time management, and also their approaches to learning, so deep or surface approaches to learning. They also affect learning. And these are things that in some universities, mechanisms are being put in place to start to think about how can we solicit this information. Identity is really important in a lot of workplace subjects, for instance. Are people developing not just as students, but also as workers? Hazel, how am I going for time?
You're right on your 11:30 now.
Okay. This was some work just feeding on from that. So, you know, there are other universities as well, and I'm happy to share all of the references. But this was some work that I did with one of the schools at UniSA, actually, where we started to think about this ABC model and recognising that ABC, so that how students think, feel, and what they actually do, as well as what we called their capitals. So that's just basically their previous experiences and their academic backgrounds. That feeds into learning, but learning at the same time that learning is occurring, it actually involves thinking processes, it involves feelings, and it involves actions. And then you've got an outcome here, and then these outcomes then shape all of that to go in again. So it's cyclical, and then retention and completion is sort of, they happen over there. We weren't so interested in that. This is what we were interested in. But we also recognised that learning occurred in a socio-cultural and also an academic context. And we actually operationalised that. So if we think about this, so we've talked learning situated, temporal, blah, blah, blah. There's something else though that's emerging, and it actually makes learning analytics a little bit trickier. And that's an emerging narrative now that's reframing how we think about learning and learning analytics from complicated to complex. And so with complexity, we're talking about tenets of emergence, that you don't have linearity, that you have, that learning is shaped by different affordances, but that we can't actually control how and in what way that's really happening. And there's some lovely learning design for learning literature, the Goodyear, for instance, where he actually puts that learning as being at the centre of design, but that the learning is emergent. His argument is that you can't design learning, but you can certainly design for learning. You put the affordances in place for it. Anyway, here are some nice papers if you're interested in that. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is impact, because people are talking about impact and is there any impact and there isn't impact and is there. But in actual fact, I actually think that there's probably more impact occurring than we realise, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But what makes this so vexed and, I guess, for me, tricky, is that it's the narrative over impact, and it's coming very much from the sector because of compliance, because of accountability, because of reporting. So a lot of the conversation around impact is because we want impact to look like this. What's causing the learning? We want it to be simple. What do we fix? Where's the 42? And in actual fact, if you're looking at learning, I think because we've already talked a little bit today about how nebulous learning is anyway, but to just one dimension shaping learning, I was recently asked, and we're doing some evaluation, but it was the use of a tool in a subject. How did that affect learning outcome? And I just thought, gosh, that's quite an extraordinary question. And it's a very, very, I had a few problems with it. Certainly we can look at how people use the tool, but to look at the causality and the relationship between that tool and actual learning outcomes across a subject when there are so many other tools that are being used is challenging. So at the moment I'm working with a particular area of the university over different models of how we might evaluate that. So, as I said, the learning here too, could it be learning gain, grades, retention, even processes? If you have people in there improving in their metacognitive sort of regulation, if you can see changes in study habits and behaviours, if you can see the emergence of different knowledges through students' engagement with their practicum experiences, improved group work, they're all learning gains. The other thing is that impact from learning analytics, and this is already occurring. I believe that learning analytics is already transforming our approaches to teaching, to knowledge and understanding, to how different analytical methods, to data management, to it's actually causing us to have some really, really important conversations about the ethical implications of data and the research impact. So I think these are all really, really nice impacts already that I wanted to remind us of. But yeah, the thing is about learning. Here's another ontological consideration: the neutrality of our data sets. And the fact that within any evaluation or anything that we set up, we're actually taking a way of seeing what we're looking at, and we do have our own understandings of that object, and we need to be mindful. So, sorry, sort of like a dog with a bone on that one. But the other thing too is each of these methods that we could be using, and even if we use more sort of simpler methods or no methods and just use our visualization, I almost feel that part of our role now is to try and also break down this expectation that there is a single truth. And I'm hearing this a lot around university circles from the BI world, that we need a single truth. to have a single truth of data is fine. You know, the data is not analysed, but to have a single truth of an analysis, I think is a little bit vexed, because each of the ways that you choose your data, the data that you choose to put into something, the method that you choose, you're already shaping the answer that you're going to get. This is a blog post that I really encourage you to have a look at. So Taki, of course, is pretty famous for, you know, t-test sort of work that we press the button on in SPSS, and we use his whatever it is method, but he was a famous mathematician sort of at the beginning of the 20th century. And a colleague that I work with sent this through, and I love this line. If you have a look at the quote there, far better an approximate answer to the right question, which is often vague, than an exact answer to the wrong question, which can always be made precise. And I think this is the difference between the summative and the formative that I was talking about before. So, you know, there is a time and a place where we need that. What is the first question? Oh yes, the metric, let's report to it, that's great. But the real richness can come from really trying to refine your questions. And often, I'm sure that you find that the first thing you do when you give academics data is they will ask a question. Oh, so what does that mean? And what if we were to allow for this or filter for this? And that's a fantastic process of discovery. The person who wrote the blog then went on to reflect on his take from Taki and put it in the context of his world as a data scientist. So he was sort of saying that as a data scientist, you'll see to the right-hand side there is a purple dot with "we think we start here." So and that dot there represents people think that they start with a great question. So you hear people often say, yes, it's got to be question-led, and that's good, you know, and your questions hopefully are grounded in theory and blah, blah, blah. But I think we start here and then we just go up to the red dot and we've got the answer, and that's fantastic. He's actually saying that often we start with a more limited question than we think, and that we are actually kind of moving through good statistics to kind of nice answers for that. But in actual fact, the real richness comes from that squiggly line. And I wonder how many people in this room work in that space of the squiggly line, where you're working with academics and you keep going back with revised tools, revised data, revised ways of thinking about it, the phenomenon. It's a nice blog. I'm not sure if you can see, I've got something, I'll just get rid of that over there. And I'm going to quickly go through here, because a lot of learning analytics talk about the individual agent, but, and that's the student. Oh yeah, the student will do this, we'll make it personalised, student will do this, let's look at what the student's doing, let's look at the regulation of the student, how are they regulating themselves. But a lot of what the student does is situated. And what does that mean? So you'll hear this word, and I use it a lot. So learning is situated and therefore shaped by the context that it's in. And two of the dominant contexts that learning occurs in is pedagogical context, which is basically the design structures, the pedagogies, the curriculum. And that does shape how students learn. And Bart Rientis has done some work that showed that learning design accounted for 69% of student behaviour in the VLE at Open University. I think he had some number in that study of 80,000 or something. It wasn't as massive as studies that he's done, but it's still really, really significant. So how we in our communities think about what content, how we expect people to engage with the VLE, how we structure that, or their LMS, that's actually affecting their engagement patterns. And so there's some really nice work going on around this. And there's some nice work there. That's the one that showed the 69%. some work that we're doing, this is a really horribly clunky diagram, but at the university that I'm at the moment, we've got a project where we're using De La Fuente Arias' model of self-regulated learning, because it's a situated model, and the self-regulation, his argument is that student self-regulation practices develop, and they're shaped by the learning context and the learning design. So his argument is that students' ability to regulate themselves learners is shaped by what they do down here, but also by the learning context. So I'm kind of involved in thinking about how we operationalise some of this. How can we actually quantify things like teacher and social presence and tasks and different natures of the learning design that might shape how students regulate themselves. It's interesting. The other context, of course, is sociocultural. You know, it's quite interesting that you know, one of the founding, I guess, one of the dominant paradigms at the moment is Vygotsky, and the fact that socio-constructivist learning and the co, basically, students, we think, will enter learning with others. And that's always informed our learning and teaching, but now we're entering a world where this may not be the dominant, but who knows? There are certainly ways of thinking about this in the online environment, and even in the online environments where we think it's really privileging the agentic, the co might be there in ways that we're not aware of. And the other thing too is, with our new environments, you know, are they privileging particular cohorts in ways that we weren't even expecting? It's something to be mindful of. So that's another context. And so one thing that I'm trying to do at the moment too is think, how can we operationalise this to bring this into our learning analytics as well? Okay, so how do we do all this complex stuff? This is just some grabs that I did at the last minute. So starting simple, you know, so I come in, I've got all these great ideas, and everyone around me is freaking out, like, Cass, seriously, how do we do this? We started to change our visualization to tell stories and to bring in temporality. This is a very early draft of some work in the team that I'm in, where we, rather than just showing grades and grade distribution, we actually showed flows between. So you can see that the HDs are reducing over time, that the fails were pretty high in assessment 3, and also where those fails came from, and then what the final grade was. That could be helpful and more, you know, powerful in translating information. We do a lot of this forum mapping. We do this to show where academics use the forum boards. If forum boards are not important to the academic, we're not privileging this at the moment. We're not prioritising it. But for many academics, this is actually quite powerful for them, particularly as one of our metrics that they have to report about is that they're setting up, even in the online environment, space for students to feel connected with each others. So they want to see how that looks. The other thing that we've got a sense of here is, if we look at the one to the left, blue dot in the centre is your teacher, and you can see that most of the interactions in the left visualisation are occurring to the teacher. It's a very didactic sort of form of the board. The one to the right, you've actually got the emergence of little networks and cluster groups within the class, which can be interpreted by the academic. With that I was talking about, these were the different instruments that we introduced, and we also introduced some NLP approaches to sort of think about teaching identity, reflection, mastery over time. So that we did by interrogating journal reflections. But these instruments were all embedded through the program at Timely Way, so across the 4-year program at Timely Way. So I've now left UniSA, but when I now know that they have 4 years of data that shows how students were thinking and feeling throughout their program, and they're able to marry that against what they actually did and how they actually achieved. There are great taxonomies and emerging ideas that I think that show learning and different elements of learning in a very sort of holistic, multidimensional way, but that are really, really nice for us to pull from. So please don't be frightened to look at some of this literature. If you ever want a nice little table that shows how you might proxy a certain construct, I'll probably know where it is. So one thing I am doing at the moment is like I said before, I am actually in the process of operationalising pedagogical context. I'll start by doing that qualitatively, and then we'll try and see if we can come up with some, basically codify it and put it into numbers so that we can start putting it into different clustering and different modelling so that we get a sense of how that intersects with what students do. I'm done. Now, I'm going to hand over to Hazel, and I would love to hear what people think here about these questions or other questions that you might have, but very much with a view to, are these some of the questions that you're grappling with? Do you sometimes feel unsupported? Are there ways that we could be working together as a community to address some of the complex challenges that we're facing at the moment? In answer to the front question, are we staring at a trough? I actually think we're on the slope to enlightenment. I actually think that there's a really, really nice sort of discriminating future coming up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cass. There's been a little bit of chat going on along the side there. So, Peter, do you want to come in here and ask your questions that you raised for Cass? I'll pass the mic over to you.
Hazel, is Peter there?
He should still be there.
Hello.
There. Go ahead, Peter. And thank you, Phil.
Apparently, if you take the system off mute, it works a lot better. I think the initial question I had was, are we trying to do too much with learning analytics? It seems that if I look back at the consumer marketing and FMCG, there are parallels going back perhaps almost a generation where they were trying to do too much and answer too many questions that hadn't been asked or questions that weren't relevant. And I think that you're right, we're moving up towards the slope of enlightenment. And I think that there is the opportunity for learning analytics to be a lot more pragmatic. Now, that's a question that's turned into a statement, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that.
Hazel, how many people do we have? Just for people, I cannot see the Collaborate screen at the moment because of the way that I've entered the site.
We've got 26 people.
So we can't give everyone mic, because I would be really interested in what people in the community think about that. I think pragmatism is really important. Pragmatism that brings a value proposition, pragmatism that brings meaningful insights that are going to talk to our academics. I think that is right. But in the flipping is that in order to do that, we need to understand that learning is complex. Because if we kind of give very simple stories that are incomplete stories or not meaningful stories, then we lose the academic. That's just my take. But is there a way that people can put hands up if they've got something to say to that? Because I think, Peter, you're hitting on a really critical point there.
Yes, there is, and that's exactly what I was about to say. If anyone else wants to jump in at any time, please. The bottom of your screen, you should see a little icon that says raise your hand. So if I see hands raising, I will certainly get those people to speak. And the other person that was speaking in the chat was Stuart, and he was saying agreeing. I think if I've interpreted correctly, agreeing with some of what you were saying there, that are we limiting learning analytics to data sets and finding the right answers? And I think you addressed that in some of your later slides, Cass. But Stuart, do you want to join here?
Oh no, I'll let Howard Green a provocateur, I think. But yes, I think Cass has well and truly covered that. But it is something well worth thinking about. That yeah, we need more than one bow in our arrow. No, one arrow in our bow.
It's interesting. If you know that blog that I showed, the Tucky blog, which I really do recommend people. It wasn't written by Tucky. I'm going to be appalling and say I cannot remember the person who wrote the blog, but it's in the slides and you'll be able to find it. And the person that did that that diagram of quality of question and quality of evidence. But one of the things that Tucky also wrote in his very early treatises on maths was data analysis involves thinking about what the problem is, trying a method to come up with an answer, then trying every competing method to come up with other answers. And yeah, I was sort of speaking a little bit to what we're talking about here. I was just reflecting, Peter, on what you were saying about are we asking too much? I think that part of what happened, because I work in a world where, you know, I get all sorts of academic reactions. So across the university, there are academics who love learning analytics. There are academics who are a bit ambivalent, and there are academics that will hardly touch it. And the ones that will hardly touch it, sometimes they've never even embraced it, but sometimes they've embraced it and it wasn't quite what they want. And I think early on, I think, you know, by sort of over promising and then delivering on perhaps it was the nature of the question, the spurious question. It wasn't the right question for an academic. You know, if you're just showing clicks in a class and here's your content, is that the right academic for all? I mean, the right question for all academics? I'm not sure. Yeah, but half the time, the academics don't know what the question is too, actually.
That's right. And the second point that I raised a bit later was that, just in reference to that, was that learning analytics often seems to be focused on itself rather than the customer experience. And that, I think, is completely aligned with what you've said about academics with different attitudes.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, do people in the audience have anything to say to that? I think that's a really powerful observation. I think, yeah, certainly when learning analytics did emerge, and there is, you know, there is debate, even among learning analytics academics, about the viability of learning analytics as its own field of practice. And I think, you know, a lot of energy is on doing the learning analytics. And what we did in that, I feel, as a sector, is we made learning analytics activity that sat almost removed from learning and teaching. And so what we're seeing, and what was in Linda's blog that I referenced very early in this presentation, is we're now seeing a move where we're recognising as a sector that this evidence part should be embedded in the actual performance of learning and teaching. It's not that you do learning analytics, you do learning and teaching. And then if we just think of learning analytics as, well, what are the things that we're going to need to help us understand, to evaluate, to learn from what we're doing. That's the learning analytics piece, but that should be embedded in all of your considerations about learning and teaching. Does that kind of fit a little bit with what you're saying?
Yes, it does.
So
yes, it does.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I think also, if I can continue to monopolise the conversation, it seems to me that there is not a lot of difference between what is effectively educational marketing in learning analytics and consumer marketing if you can exchange, for example, a purchase decision for an exam result, then you've got learning consumers exhibiting similar sorts of variant behaviours to consumers in the marketplace. And I think that if you had the opportunity to go through how Procter & Gamble use analytics, it would probably give you some further insights how it could perhaps be applied to learning and teaching, and it could shorten some of your experiential timeframes in what would work and what wouldn't.
What do people in this call think about what Peter's just suggested? I'm aware that I'm speaking quite a lot.
I'm happy to jump in there. I don't know enough about consumer marketing to know, but I have a concern that we don't reduce our students to just consumers. There's there's much more complexity to students than just being a consumer. I think that they have very high expectations. They're coming here for a product, their degree, their learning, whatever. But I would hate us to ever go down the line of just, and I know some universities do consider students as their customers, their consumers, but that hurts for me. I think they're much more than that, and they deserve more than just that. Sorry.
I don't have your background in consumer marketing, Peter, but what I would say is that marketing is driven by a very different sort of theoretical framing from learning and teaching, and that's because of the nature of the product, if you're going to use that term, which in learning and teaching, this is the difference. Is it about that exam mark, or is it about transformation of learning? And if it's about the latter, then we're really thinking about perhaps the same things with marketing. You're trying to get people to desire something. You're trying to get them to see themselves with it. So you're actually triggering, I guess, engagement effectively, behaviourally and cognitively, but it's very different processes, I would think. So I think there are certainly things that can be learnt, and I've been at one of the projects I was at UniSA was looking at nudge theory, which comes from marketing. And all universities at the moment, I'm sure there are a number of people here, we're being KPMG'd to death. We are getting the marketing. I've been involved in a big project here about becoming marketing oriented. And so we look at the customer experience, but I think it's really important to not lose sight of the power of the learning processes and how they shape. It's not just about the demographics. It's not just about what people do. It's actually how they understand themselves as learners, their confidence in learning. So we need to just kind of situate, I guess, some of what you're saying, but put it into the learning and teaching context with what we know from learning and teaching.
Yeah, of course, don't have a problem with that at all.
Yeah. So but I appreciate. I mean, I would say that education is incredibly behind other sectors. It's incredibly behind, and we talk about ideas, and people say, "Oh, that's aspirational," and I think that's what is occurring to you. Just for instance, semantic analysis, text analysis. Oh no, that can't happen. Oh, it's happening every minute of every day in places that people don't understand. Hazel, we're coming up to time, aren't we?
So I'd like to say thank you very much, Cass, on behalf of everybody. There's a few people who've left that have commented. Thanks very much, Cass. Very useful session. What we'd like as a SIG is to get more ideas of what people would like from this last slide. So I think what we might do is send these questions around to everybody that's been here and invite you to respond to those questions. The SIG will continue to do things during the year. We've got some exciting, what we think are exciting ideas coming up, including other webinars, some face-to-face sessions, and of course everything at the conference. So we invite you all, if you're not already a member of the SIG, please do sign up to the SIG. You don't have to be an Ascolite member to do that. And we'd really like to find ways that everybody can continue these conversations. So if you're happy to do that, please let us know the best way for doing that. Last words, Cass.
Oh, no, thank you, everyone. I'm happy to continue these conversations. Thank you.